You sit in the slow hours of the night, a faint lantern glow spreading across parchment, colored walls. The air feels heavy, quiet, and strangely timeless. Imagine for a moment that the simple, unconscious act of yawning, the thing your body does when tired or bored, was not only frowned upon, but declared unlawful. Somewhere in the folds of history, a ruler, a court, or perhaps even an entire city once believed that yawning carried consequences so severe that it needed to be policed. To us, it may sound absurd. Yet in scattered records of medieval Europe, whispers of rules against yawning exist. They are rarely mentioned in grand chronicles. Instead, they appear in the margins of local statutes, the forgotten town edicts, the sermons of watchful priests. The idea was not universal, nor consistently enforced, but it lingered long enough to leave its faint trace. A law so minor that it has nearly vanished from memory. And yet, to those who lived under it, the ban on yawning was another reminder that even their smallest gestures could be seen as rebellion. The problem with yawning, according to the authorities of the time, was not the physical act itself, but the meaning attached to it. In courtrooms, in church, or before lords and kings, yawning suggested boredom. If a peasant yawned while a priest was preaching, it could be read as mockery of God's word. If a servant yawned in front of a magistrate, it looked like insolence. Even among nobles, etiquette demanded rigid attention. A yawn hinted at disrespect, at indifference, even at hidden contempt. In medieval legal culture, much of the law was about maintaining order through appearances. You were not judged solely by your actions, but by what your actions appeared to mean. A poorly timed yawn, no matter how innocent, could be construed as insult, and insult, especially toward authority, was a dangerous thing. We might think of yawning as a universal bodily reflex, but in certain courts it was transformed into a gesture of rebellion, enough to earn a fine, or in some regions a night in the stocks. To the yawner, it was a simple sign of tiredness. To the authorities, it was an attack on hierarchy. This is the dull but quietly terrifying world of small laws. We often imagine medieval justice as dramatic, public executions, trials by fire, knights defending honor. But far more common were the petty ordinances, fines for wearing the wrong shoe color, restrictions on which days you could bake bread, punishments for leaving dung too long in the street. The law against yawning belongs to this world minor, but suffocating. Imagine sitting on a hard wooden bench in a drafty village hall. The bailiff reads a charter that has little to do with you. The air is stale, your body aches, and your eyelids grow heavy. You fight the urge to open your mouth and let out a long, relieving yawn. Because if you do, the bailiff could call you out, accuse you of mockery, and fine you more than you could afford. The weight of these rules was not the severity of punishment, but the constant awareness that even your smallest movements were being observed. Yawning became one more thing to police, one more reminder that the authorities controlled not only your work and your taxes, but your body itself. Some of the earliest mentions of yawning taboos come from sermons. Medieval priests, keen to maintain reverence during Mass, scolded congregants who yawned at the altar. A yawn was read as a failure of devotion, proof that the listener's mind had wandered from God. In some parishes, rules were made. Repeated yawning during a sermon could earn public rebuke, and in rare cases, fines for disrupting holy order. These small edicts soon spread beyond the church. By the late Middle Ages, civic councils in certain towns mirrored the ecclesiastical stance. Yawning during a proclamation was an offense against civic dignity. Whether the law was written in stone or merely enforced in practice varied widely, but the idea was there. Yawning, like speaking out of turn, was a disorderly act. For peasants and artisans, who had little control over their daily lives, the threat was not so much the punishment itself, but the ridicule and shame that came with being accused. Imagine being called out in front of neighbors. This man could not even stay awake to honor the word of God. A single yawn could brand you inattentive, disrespectful, even sinful. Why does such a trivial law matter? Because it shows how power worked. Authority was not only about armies or taxes. It was about controlling gestures, faces, postures. The yawning ban reminds us that rulers feared not just rebellion, but indifference. A crowd that yawns is a crowd that is not listening. A congregation that yawns is a congregation slipping away from devotion. To suppress yawning was to demand attention, even if that attention was empty. There is a slow suffocation in such laws. They are not grand enough to spark revolt, but they erode freedom in daily life. You cannot sigh too loudly, you cannot frown at the wrong time, and you cannot yawn when tired. Living under such rules teaches you to monitor yourself constantly. It makes you complicit in your own surveillance. And so, a law against yawning half forgotten, barely recorded, speaks to something larger. It is the story of how power seeps into the most ordinary moments, of how even fatigue can be policed. Picture the scene: a dim medieval courtroom, the smell of tallow candles thick in the air. A clerk drones through legal statutes, the benches creak as villagers shift uncomfortably. One man, weary from farm labor, struggles to hold his head up. The moment his mouth begins to open, he remembers the rule. He clamps his lips shut, breathes heavily through his nose, eyes watering from the effort. Around him, others do the same, suppressing their yawns, stifling their humanity. This is what the law achieved. Not obedience born of respect, but obedience born of fear. Not reverence, but silence. And silence to authorities was good enough. But here is the puzzle. Why has this law nearly vanished from historical memory? Why do only faint traces remain? Perhaps because it was so minor, overshadowed by larger dramas. Perhaps because yawning itself felt too trivial to record. Or perhaps because those who enforced it wanted it forgotten, lest future generations mock them for their pettiness. Yet the scattered evidence is enough to suggest that yawning bans were real. Not everywhere, not always, but real enough to matter to those who lived under them, real enough to shape behavior. And so, you are left with a question. If yawning could be outlawed, what other gestures, too ordinary for us to imagine today, might once have been crimes? The hall is crowded, but the silence is thick. You find yourself sitting among villagers, merchants, and clerks, all gathered to hear another proclamation. The room smells of damp wool and smoke. The official at the front clears his throat and begins reading in a voice that drones like the hum of bees. His words are technical, dense, and far removed from your life. But you cannot let your mind wander too far, for the law is clear. If you show your weariness too openly, if you dare to stretch your jaw and let your fatigue escape, you will be accused of contempt. In this moment you realize that yawning, something so small, had become a test of loyalty. To avoid it, people adopted subtle tricks. Some pressed their lips tightly, forcing their cheeks to puff out in awkward silence. Others pinched their noses or bit the insides of their cheeks to distract themselves from the reflex. A few shuffled their feet noisily, disguising their suppressed yawn as a cough or grunt. It was not just about tiredness anymore, it was about learning to master the body under the gaze of authority. The most common setting for such scrutiny was not the court, but the church. Services could stretch on for hours, especially during feast days. Priests preached at length, chanting litanies in Latin that most villagers did not understand. You could not admit your boredom, and so you sat in rigid silence, battling your own body. Parents nudged their children, whispering warnings not to open their mouths too wide. An unlucky yawn could bring not only shame, but a fine the family could hardly afford. In some parishes, the culprit might be ordered to kneel in penance, their fatigue interpreted as spiritual weakness. Records show that in a few towns, yawning laws took on a civic form. In Basel during the late 15th century, ordinances against inattentive behavior during council readings were introduced, and yawning was listed alongside talking and mocking gestures. In other cities, yawning became an offense grouped with laughter at the wrong time or dozing off in public meetings. The authorities treated all three as symptoms of disrespect, proof that the common people did not value the solemnity of civic ritual. Of course, not everyone obeyed. Some resisted in small, hidden ways. Chroniclers note that villagers sometimes exaggerated yawns behind the backs of officials, turning the forbidden act into a private form of mockery. Others joked about yawning contests in taverns, where the act was reclaimed as entertainment. These gestures were risky, for word could spread, but they reveal the thin line between submission and rebellion. What the law tried to suppress often became more charged, more meaningful. What makes such laws remarkable is not their punishment, but their persistence. They survived for generations in some places, woven into the everyday rhythm of authority. Over time, they shaped how people carried themselves. Even without active enforcement, the memory of the rule lingered. People learned to anticipate the gaze of officials before it even arrived. They stifled yawns not because anyone was watching, but because someone might be. That lingering self-surveillance outlived the statute itself. Consider the broader context of medieval law. The focus was rarely on preventing crime in the modern sense. It was about maintaining order, hierarchy, and the image of control. Authorities issued dozens of petty regulations: which fabrics you could wear, how tall your fences could be, what time you could water your animals. The yawning ban fit neatly into this web of oversight. The point was never the act itself. The point was the discipline it imposed. You did not yawn because you feared the fine, but also because you feared being singled out, labeled inattentive, and marked as untrustworthy. In many ways, the fear of yawning reflected the fear of boredom itself. A ruler, priest, or magistrate wanted to believe their words carried weight. If audiences yawned, it betrayed a dangerous truth: that authority could be dull, that sermons could be tedious, that proclamations could mean little to those who heard them. By criminalizing yawning, the powerful denied that truth. They demanded reverence not through persuasion, but through enforced silence. This quiet pressure reshaped social life. Villagers whispered about those who had been caught yawning, mocking them as careless or sinful. Children were scolded into learning bodily discipline from a young age. Even apprentices in guilds were instructed to hold themselves upright and suppress signs of fatigue in the presence of masters. To show tiredness was to show weakness. To show weakness was to invite punishment. And yet, there was also a strange solidarity in shared suppression. You could sit through hours of a long sermon, watching your neighbors struggle to keep their jaws shut, and know that they felt the same ache as you. In those quiet, stifled moments, the law unintentionally created a silent fellowship of resistance. Everyone suffered together under the same petty rule, and everyone knew its absurdity. It was in the flicker of an eye roll, the quick smirk when the priest looked away, the muffled snort of laughter when someone failed to hold back. The law that aimed to control also generated subtle bonds of defiance. By the 16th century, references to yawning bans had already begun to fade. Larger concerns took over: wars, plagues, the Reformation, the rise of new states. Petty laws lost their place in the great chronicles. But that does not mean they disappeared from daily life. In villages, parishes, and guild halls, the memory of the ban lingered. The cultural weight of not yawning in public carried on, even as statutes changed. For some communities, the lesson had been absorbed so deeply that it no longer required enforcement. People disciplined themselves out of habit long after the law was gone. You are left with a lingering thought. If so many generations shaped their behavior around such a small law, how much of our daily conduct today still carries the imprint of forgotten rules? Do we, without realizing it, still suppress simple gestures out of ancient fears we no longer name? The candlelight flickers on the walls of an old parish hall. The benches creak, and the air is so stale it feels as if it has been trapped there for centuries. You sit, half listening to the recitation of rules, half trying not to drift into the dull haze of your own thoughts. A man nearby coughs into his sleeve, and you sense the tug of your own fatigue pulling at your jaw. Yet even now, centuries after the law itself has faded, you hesitate. the memory of that old prohibition lingers in imagination, shaping the way you think of something as harmless as a yawn. By the 17th century, most references to yawning as a punishable offense had disappeared from legal codes. The world was preoccupied with larger matters, monarchs rising and falling, wars reshaping borders, new religious movements redrawing Europe's soul. Small ordinances about bodily gestures no longer seemed worth recording, but in that silence lies the weight of habit. Rules that had once been codified into fines and punishments had already done their work. Generations had grown up learning that to yawn in the wrong place was dangerous. That instinct did not vanish overnight. It settled into etiquette, into unspoken codes of respectability, into the ways people carried themselves in front of authority. Consider how even today, in schools or courtrooms or workplaces, people suppress yawns. You do not want to appear inattentive. You do not want to seem bored. You do not want to give the impression that you are dismissing someone's words. These are not written laws anymore, yet they operate with the same quiet force. A gesture policed centuries ago still shapes our instincts now. The power of forgotten laws lies in the way they survive invisibly, embedded in behavior. It is easy to laugh at the absurdity of punishing someone for yawning, but absurdity was never the point. The real point was obedience. By teaching people to police their smallest actions, the law created a habit of self-control that stretched into every corner of life. You did not only watch your mouth for yawns, you watched your tongue for speech, your eyes for glances, your hands for gestures. A society that could regulate something as trivial as fatigue could regulate anything. That was the deeper lesson, one that endured long after the law was gone. And yet, hidden within that history is also a quiet story of resistance. People still yawned, of course. They yawned in secret. They yawned behind closed doors. They yawned in taverns where no priest or magistrate could see. They yawned deliberately to mock the absurdity of the rule. The very act of stifling a yawn could become a private joke, a shared recognition of power's limits. In those moments, the human body asserted itself against control. However small, it was a rebellion. The forgotten law against yawning reminds you that history is not only made of battles and kings. It is made of the tiny regulations that shaped how people sat, breathed, and carried themselves. It is made of the unnoticed burdens that weighed on peasants and clerks more heavily than any royal decree. For every dramatic event recorded in chronicles, there were hundreds of petty rules that determined how ordinary people lived each day. To study them is to study the texture of power itself, not just the spectacle, but the everyday fabric of control. Now, as the lantern light fades and silence fills the hall, you are left with a thought that stretches beyond history. If yawning could once be outlawed, then what small, everyday gestures of ours will someday be remembered as absurd? What ordinary habits, shaped by rules we no longer notice, will future generations uncover and wonder at, shaking their heads at our obedience? The great rivers of the world are remembered for their majesty, their floods, their trade routes. Yet alongside them are the canals, the smaller arteries of water cut by human hands. Unlike rivers, canals do not roar with nature's power. They are the quiet labor of thousands of ordinary people who bent earth, stone, and mud into straightened lines of water. The story of canals is not dramatic. It is slow, repetitive, measured. But it is also one of the most important stories in human history, for it shaped how food moved, how empires breathed, and how people survived. Imagine, then, the life of a canal worker in Ming Dynasty China during the 15th century. You stand at dawn with a shovel made of wood and iron, your feet bare in the mud. The foreman shouts instructions, but most of the day passes in silence. There is no need for words when the task is endless. Dig, carry, pile, repeat. The canal stretches for miles, and your body becomes part of its rhythm. The world around you is not filled with the noise of machines, but with the steady scrape of tools, the grunt of effort, the occasional splash of falling soil. To build water roads, you must give years of your life to the quietest of labors. The Grand Canal of China is the largest man-made waterway in history, linking the fertile south with the political capitals of the north. It was begun centuries earlier, but in the Ming era it was rebuilt, expanded, and maintained with relentless human energy. Grain from the Yangtze Valley needed to reach Beijing. Without the canal, the emperor's court would starve. And so, peasants were drafted by the thousands to dig and dredge, to haul stones, to line embankments. Their names were rarely recorded. They were not generals, not poets, not officials. They were silent workers, remembered only by the water that still flows where they once stood. Life on the canal project was hard in a way that did not make headlines. There were no sudden disasters, no glorious victories. Instead, there was monotony. You woke before sunrise, ate a small bowl of millet porridge, and walked to the site. The day was measured by the shadows of the sun and the ache in your shoulders. Breaks were short, food was scarce, and the overseers were strict. You dug in pairs, then in groups, slowly moving earth until a channel appeared. It was not the kind of work that could be rushed, and so time itself seemed to dissolve into the repetition. The silence of the workers was not only physical, it was enforced. To complain was to risk punishment. To question why you had been conscripted was to invite the lash. The officials insisted that the canal was the emperor's lifeline, and that all who labored were serving the realm. That phrase, serving the realm, justified the hunger, the exhaustion, the endless shoveling. In reality, you were serving survival. The empire's survival, yes, but also your own. To refuse the summons was to risk imprisonment or worse. To comply was to endure and hope for release. Water was both the enemy and the goal. Workers battled floods that destroyed weeks of effort. Heavy rains could collapse newly dug walls, swallowing men into mud. In the dry season, the soil hardened into stubborn clay, breaking tools and bruising hands. Every stroke of the shovel was contested by the earth itself, and yet, slowly, the line of water took shape, guided by human will. What made canal work so wearying was not only the physical strain, but the invisibility of it. You could dig for years and never see the full canal. You worked on one stretch of bank, day after day, with no sense of the larger whole. Perhaps you knew the water would carry grain to the capital, but you never saw the barges, the bustling markets, the imperial kitchens fed by your labor. Your life remained in the mud, your legacy hidden in the water's current. Food was another burden. Rations were meager, often just steamed buns or porridge. Meat was rare, vegetables occasional. Malnutrition was common, and illness spread easily among the camps. Dysentery and fevers could sweep through groups of workers, yet the digging never stopped. New conscripts replaced the sick, and the line of shovels moved on. For the empire, the canal had to flow. For the worker, there was no choice. Evenings offered little relief. After hours of digging, you returned to crowded huts or tents. The air was damp, the bedding straw. Men collapsed side by side, their snores mixing with the croak of frogs and the distant splash of water. Conversation was muted, not only from exhaustion, but from caution. Complaints could be overheard, and informers were always present, and so the silence continued, even in rest. The canal was dug in silence, lived in silence, endured in silence. Yet in this silence lay resilience. The workers developed quiet methods of endurance. Some carved marks into trees or stones to measure the passage of days. Others sang softly to themselves while working, their voices too low to be punished, but enough to keep rhythm. A few developed jokes whispered only in safe company, mocking officials with nicknames. These were small acts, but they mattered. In a labor where individuality was erased, such gestures kept a spark of humanity alive. The canal itself, when finished, looked simple, a long, narrow stretch of water lined with stones edged by paths. Barges floated calmly upon it, carrying grain northward. To travelers, it appeared serene, even beautiful. But beneath that still surface lay the memory of thousands of workers who had spent years in mud and silence. Every smooth curve of water was shaped by their suffering. Every stone placed on the bank carried the weight of hands now forgotten. To study the canal is to study not only engineering, but also the cost of endurance. The emperor may have celebrated the canal as a triumph of governance. Officials may have recorded it as proof of imperial order. But for the workers, it was not triumph but survival. They did not dig for glory. They dug because they were told to. They dug because hunger left them no alternative. They dug because the silence left no space for refusal. As you picture the still water of the canal under moonlight, you might ask yourself, if history remembers the great works of empires, why does it so rarely remember the silence of those who built them? The air hangs heavy with dampness as you press deeper into the fields, where water and earth mingle until neither feels separate. Your feet sink with each step, a soft sucking sound following you like a shadow. The canal workers, silent, wiry figures with weather-worn faces, move in rhythm, shovels biting into the soil, baskets rising and falling like pendulums of labor. They do not sing, they do not speak. Only the slap of mud, the scrape of wood, and the occasional grunt from straining backs fills the space. You watch as one man pauses, his body bent forward, his breathing slow and deliberate. He straightens only enough to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of his muddy hand before bending again. His silence is not choice. It is necessity. Words would only cost air, and air is precious in a day that stretches endlessly under a gray and indifferent sky. The canal itself looms like an unfinished scar in the earth, its banks raw and jagged. Water trickles weakly into the trench, clouded with silt, refusing to settle clear. Every basket of dirt removed feels swallowed by the vastness of the task, as if human effort is no more than a raindrop in the wide basin of time. And still they dig. You feel your own shoulders ache just watching the rhythm, the stooped postures carved into their spines. It is less work than endurance, an endless bargain between body and earth, a trade of strength for survival. No overseer shouts orders here, no lash cracks the air. The silence of their labor is its own command, as binding as chains. When the wind shifts, it carries the scent of stagnant water mixed with the faint, metallic tang of sweat and old tools. It is not unpleasant, only grounding. This is what the world smells like when humans bend it to their will. This is what survival demands: mud beneath nails, silence in the throat, and the patience to carve rivers where no river wished to flow. Would you keep digging if you knew the canal may never truly belong to those who built it? The sun dips low, and the last glow of daylight clings stubbornly to the wooden beams above the water. You step carefully along the planks that stretch like fragile ribs across the canal's surface, listening to the creak of wood beneath your calloused feet. The world is narrow, sky above, water below, and you suspended in the middle. A strange quiet wraps itself around the evening. The clatter of picks and the cries of overseers have stilled for now, leaving only the groan of the current as it swirls against the walls of the half-finished canal. You lower yourself onto a beam, letting your legs dangle. Your reflection shivers in the dark water, but even that image feels tired, as if it too longs for sleep. The smell of mud lingers on your skin, no matter how much you scrub, and the river wind cannot chase it away. Still, there is a calmness here. The stillness makes you feel, for a moment, that this endless labor is not punishment, but part of a rhythm older than you, older than rulers, older even than this river's banks. A thin mist curls upward, softening the outlines of distant huts. In that blur, everything becomes uncertain, where land ends, where water begins, where tomorrow will place you. The canal is both promise and weight. You imagine boats drifting one day, carrying grain and salt and silk. But you also imagine the bones of workers, swept downstream, their names lost before they could even be spoken aloud. As night presses deeper, a low drum sounds far away, a signal from the watchpost. It is not a threat, not yet, but a reminder. Rest will not last forever. You know that when dawn returns, the overseer's whip will cut the air again, and your hands will bleed anew against stone and mud. But for now, in this small pocket of dusk, you can sit with the water's breath and your own. And though you cannot say why, you feel that the silence of this canal is listening back. You stand at the edge of a wide, flat plain. There is nothing dramatic here, no battles raging, no kings addressing their armies, no monuments rising toward the sky. Instead, there are mounds, rounded shapes covered with clay, stone, or wood. They do not shine, they do not impress. They are silos, storage pits, and granaries. And yet, these unassuming structures held the fate of entire civilizations. When you think of the rise of ancient empires, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, you might imagine armies, temples, and rulers. But behind all of them, behind the noise of history, lay grain. Grain was the fuel of societies. Grain kept soldiers marching, families fed, cities stable. The harvest was not only about eating, it was about power. Whoever controlled the silos controlled survival itself. Consider Egypt along the Nile. Every year, the flooding river deposited fertile soil along its banks. Farmers planted wheat and barley, then hauled the harvest into communal granaries. These silos were more than storage. They were state instruments. Officials measured, taxed, and guarded them. The silos represented stability during years of flood and salvation during years of drought. Pharaohs were not only rulers of temples, they were guardians of grain. The ability to open silos during famine gave them an aura of divinity. To feed the hungry was to prove divine legitimacy. In Mesopotamia, the story was similar, though the land was harsher. Irrigation systems cut across the plains, feeding barley fields. Here, storage was even more vital. Clay, sealed silos, shaped like inverted jars, dotted the settlements. Archaeologists still find remnants of these pits, charred seeds preserved by accident, offering a window into diets thousands of years old. To you, these tiny finds may seem dull, but in their day, they decided life and death. A poorly sealed silo could mean rot, infestation, or loss to thieves. Entire states rose and fell depending on the stability of these storage systems. By the time of the Roman Republic and Empire, grain silos had become instruments of political negotiation. Rome was vast and hungry. The city itself could not feed its swelling population. Ships carried grain from Sicily, Egypt, and North Africa, pouring it into storage facilities called horia. These were monumental compared to earlier silos, long, warehouse-like structures made of stone and brick. Inside, workers stacked sacks of grain in rows, turning sustenance into a form of bureaucracy. Senators debated grain prices. Emperors won loyalty by ensuring cheap bread. Even riots in the streets of Rome were often about silos, whether they were full, whether they were guarded, whether the flow of grain had stalled. And so, you begin to see, history's great turning points were not always about glory or conquest. They were about whether the silos were full or empty. Yet, these structures were not only about feeding cities. They were about preserving order. Grain rots quickly if not stored properly. Moisture invites mold. Warmth attracts insects, rats slip in through cracks, and so entire systems of management developed. Workers had to measure humidity, inspect walls, seal openings with clay. Boring details, yes, but failure in any one detail could lead to catastrophe. One spoiled harvest was survivable. 2 in a row could collapse dynasties. Think of it this way: when you picture the grandeur of pyramids, remember that they were built in part because Egypt's silos allowed farmers and workers to survive. When you imagine Roman legions, remember that their strength marched from horia, filled with grain. And yet, as you walk past these silent, ancient structures in your mind, you are left with a question. How could something so ordinary, so boring, be the very thing that determined whether nations rose or fell? The city stirs awake as the morning sun pushes through the mist that hangs heavy over its narrow alleys. You step out into the streets where stone walls lean close, where the shadows of the early hour stretch like long arms. Here you see not the noble or the wealthy, but the men and women who move silently with tools slung over their shoulders, baskets of goods pressed to their backs, and dust rising with each deliberate step. Their work is not celebrated, not carved into records, but without them, the city would collapse under its own weight. You follow the canal workers as they descend into the heart of the waterways. The water is low today, clogged with silt, refuse, and the waste of thousands of households. They bend to their task without complaint, their hands raw and cracked, their bodies hardened by repetition. Wooden shovels scrape against mud, clay buckets pass from one calloused palm to another, and the canal walls echo with the rhythm of labor. The smell is sharp, layered with rot, fish, and the tang of damp stone. Yet no one comments. It is work that demands silence, work that leaves little room for words. You notice how their eyes do not rise to the rooftops where sunlight touches tiles in bright patterns. They remain fixed on the muck at their feet. Each motion is practiced, scoop, lift, carry, dump, until the act becomes almost mechanical. Children hover nearby, thin and quiet, waiting for their parents to emerge, sometimes joining in when buckets are light. Their small bodies bend as though they were already trained for the same endless duty. You see one child balance on the edge of the canal, wobbling slightly, before dropping down into the shallow water to help. No one laughs, no one warns. The boy learns through the weight of mud pressing against his skin. The silence is heavy, broken only by the scrape of tools and the muted splash of water. But in that silence, you also sense a quiet resilience. No one here expects praise, nor freedom from their task. Instead, there is an understanding shared between them, an unspoken bond built through exhaustion and endurance. The city above may bustle with trade, arguments, and music, but down here in the veins of the canal, there is only the sound of survival. As the hours stretch, the sun climbs higher, yet the workers remain bent at their stations. Dust coats their hair, sweat streaks their necks, and the day goes on without a pause. You realize this silence is not emptiness. It is the voice of a city's foundation, the quiet strength that holds life steady. The smoke lingers in the air, faint and bitter, as though the canal itself is exhaling after decades of back-breaking labor. You walk along the embankment, your bare feet slipping on the damp soil, and your body feels like it has become an extension of the land itself, mud, caked, scarred, endlessly eroded by wind and water. The canal stretches beside you like a vein carved into the earth, carrying the lifeblood of the empire. Villagers call it a blessing, workers call it a wound, and you, caught somewhere in between, feel both truths as you drag your weary frame forward, shoulders aching from years bent beneath the weight of spades, baskets, and impossible demands. The overseer's whistle still echoes in your memory. That shrill note, cutting through the hum of insects and the groan of shifting soil, meant one thing: hurry or face punishment. You learned early that there is no rhythm to the day except the rhythm imposed by others. The sun does not rise for you. It rises for the canal. It sinks, too, not for your rest, but to mark the hours when the overseer's lanterns flare, and their shadows lengthen like black snakes across the muddy fields. You have worked by moonlight, by torchlight, by the light of a burning bundle of reeds when oil grew scarce. The sky has no pity, neither does the water. You remember the first time you saw the project. You were a child then, too small to carry a proper shovel, but big enough to fetch water for older men whose spines cracked like kindling under the endless hauling. The canal seemed larger than thought itself, a ditch that swallowed villages, hills, and forests. Workers became ants against its vast, yawning banks. For years you thought it was bottomless, that the earth had no end. Now, after decades of labor, you know better. The canal has an end. It has many. But each time one stretch is finished, another begins, as if the empire itself is a beast that cannot stop eating, cannot stop swallowing earth until its jaws drip with rivers. Sometimes, in dreams, you still hear the sound of the earth collapsing. A rush of soil, a groan like thunder, and suddenly men vanish beneath it, limbs thrashing once, twice, before silence. The overseers rarely stop the work for such things. They mark the place where bodies disappear, mutter something about sacrifice, and move on. And so the canal has taken more than dirt. It has taken fathers, brothers, sons, and friends, layering them into its banks as though human bone were no different than stone. When water rushes through in the flood months, you imagine it whispers their names, though you know no one else hears. Your body remembers what your mind tries to forget. The sores on your hands never truly healed, because the moment they hardened into calluses, the work tore them open again. Your back aches in ways that no herb, cellar can soothe. Sometimes you press your palm against your chest at night, convinced the pounding inside is not your own heart, but the canal's, still demanding, still pulling. And yet, you wake, you stand, you return, because what else is there? You have a family, and they cannot eat if you do not give yourself to the canal. Hunger is another overseer, quieter but just as cruel. Once there was laughter here. When the laborers were younger, some found ways to carve joy out of misery. Songs shouted over the roar of digging. Crude jokes passed from one mud, stained mouth to another. A boy once carved a flute out of bamboo and played during rest breaks, and for a fleeting instant the sound of water seemed almost like music rather than menace. But the boy grew sick one summer and was carried off within days. The flute was buried with him, and no one has played since. Laughter, too, was buried, replaced by silence so heavy that even birds do not linger near the camps. What remains is rhythm, and rhythm alone. Shovel, lift, carry, dump. The cycle repeats, unending, until it fills your thoughts even when you lie still. Sometimes you dream of repeating the motion forever, arms aching, sweat pouring down your temples. You wake only to discover that the dream was no different from your waking life. The canal has reshaped more than the land. Villages that once lay near rivers now find themselves bordered by mud walls and redirected streams. Fields drown where water pools too long. Others crack when the flood bypasses them entirely. Farmers curse the emperor's engineers, but their curses are swallowed by the same silence that devours your laughter. Even when the harvest fails, even when children cough blood into their beds, the work continues. Because the canal is not just a canal, it is a decree, and decrees do not vanish simply because they bleed those who obey. Sometimes you wonder, does the emperor even know your name? Does he picture faces like yours when he imagines the grand arteries of water feeding his cities? Or are you nothing more than a figure in a report, one laborer among thousands, a number that can be erased without a trace? The thought burns. Yet you also know the truth. Emperors are like rivers. They do not notice the drops that make them whole. At night, when the overseers sleep and the workers collapse in heaps along the embankments, you stare at the stars. They look down without judgment, without pity, without interest. The same stars have watched other canals rise, other dynasties demand, other laborers sweat and fall. Perhaps they will still be watching when this canal dries, its banks crumbling into dust. It comforts you, in a strange way, to know that the stars will forget you as quickly as emperors do. Oblivion is the most honest mercy you can imagine. Yet there are moments, rare and fleeting, when you feel something else stir. When the first rains fall after months of dryness, and the water rushes through the channel you shaped with your own hands, glimmering like liquid silver under the moon, you feel. Not pride, but recognition. This scar in the earth is yours as much as it belongs to emperors and maps. Your sweat runs in it. Your breath lingers above it. Your bones, when they finally collapse, will join those already layered within its soil. The canal is cruel. The canal is merciless. But it is also yours. And so you walk its edge again, under a sky thick with clouds, your footsteps sinking into mud that knows you better than any human voice. You walk and you do not stop, because the canal does not stop, because hunger does not stop, because the empire does not stop. You walk until the horizon blurs, until the water's surface ripples with a wind that feels almost kind. You wonder, as you sink to your knees, if someday someone will look at this canal and see only the water, not the bodies. Only the flow, not the wounds. You wonder if your name, forgotten already in the tally of laborers, will live on in the current itself. You wonder, and you let the questions drift, because there are no answers here. Only work, only silence, only the canal. The morning after the storm has a strange quiet to it, the kind that makes you uneasy. The ground is still damp, the earth breathing out steam as the first rays of sunlight touch the broken fields. Your bare feet sink slightly into the soil as you walk, the hem of your coarse hemp tunic brushing against your ankles, already wet with dew. The sound of your steps is muffled, as if the land itself is holding its breath. The village stirs around you. Thin trails of smoke rise from clay chimneys, and the smell of millet porridge drifts into the air, weak but comforting. Children cough behind shuttered doors, and roosters crow as though trying to convince the world that all is well, that yesterday's thunder and flood were nothing more than a passing shadow. Yet the truth lingers on every face. The harvest is half ruined, the paddies scarred, and fear sits silently at the table with every family. You pass by your neighbor, an old man hunched like a bent willow, who uses a stick to prod at the mud clogging his doorway. His eyes, clouded with age, meet yours. He does not greet you. He simply nods, a tired gesture, less respect than acknowledgement of shared struggle. Words are unnecessary. Everyone knows what has been lost. Everyone knows what may yet come. Down the lane, a group of women kneel beside a collapsed fence. They try to repair it with reeds and leftover branches, their hands moving in rhythm, but the reeds are brittle and the wood is scarce. One of them mutters about taxes, about how the grain collectors will not accept excuses carved by storms. Another whispers about spirits, about how the gods of the river must have been offended. Their murmurs blend with the sound of water trickling through the ditches, forming a hymn of worry. You keep walking because you have been summoned. The village headman called for all able-bodied peasants to gather by the granary. It is not a request, it is an order, and orders in this world weigh more than the heaviest stone. So you go, though your heart is heavy and your stomach emptier than you'd like to admit. At the granary, people stand in small clusters. Men lean on hoes like weary soldiers resting on spears. Women clutch children against their hips. Everyone wears the same look, part defiance, part resignation. The granary itself looms like a silent witness, its walls of packed clay patched with straw, its roof sagging under years of neglect. The headman arrives, his back straight, his robe of rough cotton tied with a faded sash. He carries a bamboo staff that gives him the illusion of authority he barely possesses. Still, authority is not in appearance alone. It is in the fact that he represents power, and behind him stands the weight of officials, soldiers, and laws carved like chains. He clears his throat and speaks. His voice is steady but not loud, for he does not need volume to command attention. He speaks of the storm, of the damage, of the hardships all can see. He does not dwell on sympathy. Instead, he reminds the villagers of their obligations, grain quotas, labor duties, taxes owed to the prefecture. His words fall like cold rain, unavoidable, steady, uncaring. Some murmur. One man, tall and broad, dares to ask if the quotas will be reduced given the flood. The headman shakes his head slowly, eyes narrowing. He does not raise his voice, but he speaks with the weight of iron. The quotas are set by officials far away, men who have never touched the mud of these fields. To ask for mercy is to invite punishment. To protest is to invite ruin. You feel the mood shift around you, shoulders sag. Hope leaks out like water from a cracked jar. The villagers are trapped between nature, which has already struck, and rulers who will strike again if displeased. When the meeting ends, people disperse quietly. Some cry, some curse under their breath. Most simply walk away, returning to the tasks that will never be enough. you linger, not because you want to, but because you see the headman watching you. His gaze is sharp, as though measuring you for something you have not yet been told. When you finally step away, your chest feels tight. It is not just hunger or exhaustion. It is the sense of being watched, weighed, and possibly chosen. The day stretches long. You labor in the fields, repairing embankments, guiding the ox through the muck. The sun rises higher, its heat pressing down until your back aches and sweat stings your eyes. You force yourself to keep going, because the land does not care about your despair, and the officials will not care about your excuses. Only food can shield you, and food comes only with work. At midday, you pause by a willow tree, drinking water from a gourd. The world hums with insects, and the distant cries of cranes echo over the marshes. You think of your ancestors, who once may have lived freer lives, before dynasties rose and taxes chained men to soil. You wonder if they were happier, or if struggle has always been the only true inheritance. By dusk, your body is nearly broken. The fields look no better than they did in the morning, and tomorrow they will demand the same toil again. Still, you walk home, shoulders sagging, clothes caked in mud. At the entrance to the village, you notice something unusual. A cart, heavy and wooden, painted in dull red. 2 oxen stand yoked to it, their ribs visible beneath their hides. Soldiers lounge beside the cart, spears resting on the ground, eyes scanning the peasants like wolves surveying sheep. Their presence makes the air heavy. Beside them, an official in silk robes sits beneath a parasol. His attire is simple compared to the grandeur of the capital, yet in this place it shines like the sun. He holds a ledger, and his brush scratches across its surface, as though each mark seals someone's fate. You stop instinctively, feet rooted in the dust. You know what this means. Grain collection. The storm does not matter. Hunger does not matter. The emperor's granaries must be filled, even if your children starve. One by one, families approach. Bags of millet, baskets of rice, bundles of barley. Whatever they can spare, whatever they cannot spare, they bring. The official inspects each offering with disdain, as though every grain is his by birthright. Sometimes he nods, sometimes he frowns and orders soldiers to seize more. When your turn comes, your hands tremble. You present your share, smaller than in past years, because the storm has stolen much. The official does not look at you. He looks only at the basket, then at his ledger. His brush scratches, and you hear the sound like the closing of a door. Too little. He mutters. His voice is soft, but it carries like thunder. The soldiers shift. Your heart thuds in your chest. You want to protest, to explain, to beg. But you see the soldier's eyes, and you know words will only carve your grave. So you bow, head lowered, hands clasped. You murmur apologies. The official does not respond. He simply waves his brush, and the soldiers take more from your house. By the time you return home, your storeroom is nearly empty. You sit in the darkness, the walls pressing close, your children silent with hunger. You wonder how long you can endure. You wonder how long before despair turns to rebellion, before whispers of defiance spark like dry straw in fire. Outside, the wind rises again, rustling through the trees, carrying with it the promise of another storm. And as you close your eyes, you realize that in this world, storms come in many forms, some of water, some of power, and some of silence that chokes even the strongest hearts. You stand at the edge of a river, a wide, restless body of water that slices through the landscape like a scar of time itself. The current is not gentle. It churns and pulls, whispering threats to any who might attempt to cross it. And yet, in every age of human history, people have looked at rivers not as walls, but as challenges to be conquered. To reach the far side meant survival, meant fields to plow, trade to carry, armies to march, and worlds to connect. And so, the story of bridges begins. The first bridges were hardly what you imagine when you hear the word. No grand arches of stone, no spans of steel, no suspension cables gleaming against the sky. They were simple, Fallen logs dragged across streams, stones stacked into stepping paths, woven vines pulled tight between one bank and the other. They were crude, but they were enough. Enough for a hunter to cross. Enough for a farmer's goats to reach fresh pasture. Enough for one world to meet another. But soon, simplicity was no longer enough. Civilizations demanded permanence. They demanded bridges that could carry weight beyond the foot of a lone traveler. Villages became towns. Towns grew into cities. And cities required something stronger than luck and fallen timber. The river did not change its nature. It still surged, flooded, devoured, and swallowed what was careless. But human ambition rose against it, stone by stone, rope by rope, plank by plank. You picture an ancient Mesopotamian crossing, the dusty banks of the Euphrates alive with movement. Merchants drive donkeys laden with goods toward the water. A rope bridge sways above them, its cords creaking as traders shuffle across. Below, the river gurgles, mocking the fragility of human invention. Yet those same trembling steps carry salt, wool, and copper between lands. Without the bridge, there is only isolation. With it, there is commerce, culture, and the faint echo of empire. And so bridges became more than tools. They became symbols. To build a bridge was to declare mastery over nature, to prove that a community would not remain divided. In time, bridges would come to signify power itself. Emperors and kings etching their names into stone arches, leaving behind structures designed not only to endure floods, but also centuries. The span of a bridge was more than engineering. It was propaganda carved in granite. In ancient China, for instance, emperors ordered bridges that astonished travelers. The Jeju Bridge, built in the 7th century, stretched across the Zhao River with a grace that defied its age. Where earlier builders relied on heavy slabs and massive piles, this one floated upon a delicate arch of stone, daring gravity to object, and yet it stood. It still stands, 13 centuries later, a monument not only to mathematics and stone, cutting, but to the quiet audacity of human design. You linger in that thought, the audacity. For every bridge that succeeded, dozens failed. Whole constructions washed away by storms, timber burned or rotted, rope frayed and snapped, sending unlucky travelers tumbling into churning depths. Entire armies lost their footing when hastily built pontoon bridges collapsed under the weight of men, horses, and supply wagons. And yet failure did not end the story. It deepened it. Each collapse taught lessons. Each wreck pushed builders to think more carefully, to measure more precisely, to innovate. Bridges, after all, were never meant only for the living. They carried gods, spirits, and metaphors. In myth and legend, bridges are thresholds. To cross one is to leave one world for another, sometimes the land of the living, sometimes the land of the dead. The Vikings imagined a rainbow bridge, Bifrost, carrying warriors to Valhalla. The Japanese pictured narrow spans guarded by spirits, crossings where one wrong step might offend the gods. Even Dante, centuries later, envisioned bridges in his Divine Comedy, stone arches leading sinners from one circle of hell to the next, each one symbolizing a passage deeper into consequence. But myths aside, the practical bridge remained a battlefield in itself. To hold a bridge was to command movement. In Rome, no general could ignore that truth. Roman engineers were masters not only of aqueducts and roads, but of bridges that could be thrown across rivers in astonishing time. Julius Caesar himself once ordered a wooden bridge built across the Rhine. Simply to prove it could be done, he did not need the bridge. He wanted to demonstrate Roman dominance, to walk his legions across, terrify the Germanic tribes, and then dismantle the entire structure once the message had been delivered. A bridge, in this case, was as much a weapon as a sword. Centuries later, the Middle Ages would bring bridges into the very heart of daily life. Medieval bridges were not bare crossings. They became bustling centers of commerce, lined with shops, mills, and chapels. Imagine London Bridge in the 14th century, houses stacked upon its span, leaning precariously, their chimneys spewing smoke above the Thames. To walk across was not to step onto empty stone, but into a marketplace, alive with bakers, blacksmiths, and fishmongers. A bridge, in such times, was no longer just a connection between two banks. It was itself a destination, but you must also imagine the darker side. Bridges were narrow, crowded, dangerous. Fire swept across them as easily as it did through Wooden Town. Floodwaters rose, sweeping carts, animals, and people from their edges. Tolls were demanded at both ends, reminders that even something as necessary as a bridge was never truly free. And in war, bridges were burned, torn down, or soaked in blood as armies fought to control them. To walk across a bridge at times was to gamble with survival. Yet, despite it all, bridges endured. They remained the stubborn insistence of humanity. We will not be separated. With each century, they grew stronger, wider, more elegant. The stone arches of Europe, the suspension bridges of Asia, the aqueduct-like causeways of the New World, all reflected not only engineering progress, but also a philosophical truth. To bridge is to hope. To connect is to resist division. To step across a river on something built by human hands is, in its quiet way, a declaration of faith in tomorrow. And here, at the close of this first stretch of the tale, you stand again at the river's edge. The water has not grown kinder, the current is still merciless, but before you, stretching from your side to the horizon, is a bridge. Its surface gleams with the wear of countless footsteps. Its stones are darkened by centuries of rain. Its arch bends against gravity with a kind of timeless defiance. You step forward, onto the span, and feel beneath your feet the layered weight of history, an inheritance of ambition, failure, persistence, and triumph. You begin to walk across, but that is only the beginning. You step forward not onto the bridge itself, but onto its history. The stones underfoot seem ordinary, worn gray, moss-lipped, rough against sandals or leather boots, but every groove whispers of passage. To cross here in another century would have been to risk your life and your empire's honor. Soldiers did not merely march over this bridge, they tested its faithfulness. Merchants did not merely guide carts across, they placed their fortune in its spine. Kings, emperors, and sultans may have issued decrees, but it was the bridge that obeyed with centuries of silence. A bridge is a paradox. It is the most fragile line in an empire's veins, and yet often the strongest. Break a road, and caravans find a longer way. Break a wall, and masons rebuild it in weeks. But break a bridge, and whole armies stand stranded like cattle before a river too wide to swim. You realize, in this moment of quiet reflection, that to control a bridge was to control the direction of history. The stones speak in numbers. The Romans understood this better than most. Their aqueducts get the glory, their amphitheaters the admiration, but it was their bridges that truly bent the world. Look closer at the arches. Perfect semicircles, each stone pressed not only by gravity, but by the genius of engineering. The keystone at the top, often decorated with little more than a carved mark, bears the pressure of centuries. The secret was not mortar, but balance. Every stone leaned on its neighbor, like loyal soldiers refusing to move so long as the man beside them held his ground. Some bridges outlasted the Caesars who ordered them. In Spain, the Alcantara Bridge, built in 106 CE, still stretches proudly across the Tagus River. Its inscription does not mention the emperor who reigned, nor the generals who campaigned, but simply says, "The bridge will last forever." The arrogance is breathtaking, yet the stones have so far made good on the promise. Empires died, kingdoms withered, maps were redrawn, but the bridge remained watching. To cross is to trust. Imagine you are a merchant in medieval Europe, cart groaning with barrels of salted fish bound for market. Ahead lies a river swollen with spring rain, its waters roaring and brown. There is no ford. The bridge is your only salvation. As your oxen clatter onto the wooden planks, the sound magnifies, the hollow boom of cartwheels echoing like drums of judgment. Each creak of timber tests your nerve. You cannot swim, your cargo cannot float, and the bridgekeeper waits at the far end with his toll chest. For the peasant, a bridge was not just stone or timber. It was a gamble. Will it hold? Will the toll ruin the profit? Will raiders lie in ambush just beyond? And yet they crossed, because to stay behind was to starve. In this way, bridges did not simply carry people, they carried hope itself. Bridges as borders, you notice something curious. Bridges were rarely just bridges. They were borders in stone. To step from one bank to the other was often to step into another world. Take the Charles Bridge in Prague, built in the 14th century under Emperor Charles Roman IV. Its Gothic towers did not merely mark the entrance and exit. They announced, loudly, that you were passing into the heart of imperial ambition. Merchants saw those towers and understood. Here lay rules, taxes, and authority. Bridges became checkpoints before passports existed. Guards controlled them, tollmen taxed them, and priests blessed them. To burn a bridge was not just an act of war, it was sacrilege. To build one was not just engineering, it was an announcement. We control both sides of this river now. Faith and foundations religion also claimed its share of bridges. In medieval Europe, pious brotherhoods formed with the sole mission of building and maintaining bridges. The fratres, pontifices, or bridge brothers tended crossings as acts of devotion. To them, guiding a traveler across a river was to save a soul from drowning as much as a body from death. Donations for bridge construction were seen as holy offerings. Some monasteries even diverted revenues from vineyards to repair bridges, knowing that a fallen arch meant lost pilgrims and lost faith. In Asia, the reverence was no less profound. Chinese dynasties constructed stone arch bridges whose elegance rivaled their palaces. The Jeju Bridge, built during the Sui dynasty in the 7th century, remains the oldest opens, spandrel segmental arch bridge in the world. Unlike the heavy Roman half circle, it curved more gently, its arch lower, its silhouette softer. To step across it was to feel not just security, but harmony. Carved lions guarded its parapets, symbols of stability. Legend said that demons and floods had tried to destroy it, but the bridge endured, as though divine favor itself weighed its stones. War's favorite target, no empire, however, ever forgot the darker truth. Bridges were meant to be broken. In times of siege, destroying a bridge meant starving the enemy of reinforcements. Commanders wrote entire strategies around the taking or burning of a crossing. Julius Caesar himself, master of bridges, once ordered one built across the Rhine in 10 days, not because he needed it, but to show Germanic tribes that nowhere, not even across a roaring river, was beyond Rome's reach. Then, after marching across and back, he ordered it dismantled, leaving no gift for his enemies. Centuries later, Ottoman armies stormed into Europe along bridges, still trembling from Roman foundations. In the Balkans, the Stari Most in Mostar would become not just a way across, but a symbol of identity. To destroy it was to wound the people, to rebuild it, centuries later, was to heal. Every empire learned the same lesson. Bridges carried more than bodies. They carried pride. The bridgekeeper's world, you imagine the life of the man who kept the bridge. Not the king, not the engineer, but the humble keeper in his hut by the toll gate. His work was as much politics as it was patience. He dealt with angry merchants unwilling to pay, with noblemen demanding free passage, with soldiers pounding their fists for speed. To cheat him was to risk a fine, a whipping, or worse. To kill him was to bring wrath upon one's village, for bridges were never private. They belonged to rulers. He swept the stones, mended the planks, oiled the hinges of the gate. He knew every sound a cart made, every wobble in the timber. He knew when rain made the stones slick, when frost froze them dangerous. He was, in his own way, as essential to empire as the king. Bridges as memory, what you realize, standing in this imagined world, is that bridges became memory made solid. Lovers met on them. Criminals were hanged from them. Beggars huddled under them. Wars thundered over them. Treaties were signed upon them. They held not just weight but meaning. To this day, when languages describe reconciliation, they use bridges as metaphor. To build a bridge is to mend, to heal, to unite. The image is older than modern nations. Somewhere, a Roman engineer smiles at the irony. The structure that began as stone and mathematics became an eternal emblem of human connection. The empire in your step you feel now, the weight of centuries pressing into the soles of your feet. Every bridge you've crossed in memory was more than architecture. It was empire disguised as convenience. To cross safely, you placed trust not only in stone, but in the people who maintained it, defended it, taxed it, and sanctified it. Without bridges, rivers would have been boundaries. With them, they became roads. And so, quietly, humbly, bridges carried empires, not on their arches, not on their piers, but on the silent trust of those who crossed. The lesson settles into you slowly, like the evening mist over a river. A bridge is not simply built once. It is built every day in the faith of those who step upon it. You return to the river again, not as a wide-eyed onlooker this time, but as someone who has begun to sense that the crossing of water has always been more than a mere necessity. Empires were made and unmade by bridges, and though they look like stone or rope or timber, they are, at their core, structures of power. When you picture a bridge, perhaps you see arches carved in Roman stone, or bamboo slats strung across Himalayan gorges. But to the ancient engineers, to the rulers who funded them, and to the peasants pressed into labor beneath them, bridges were arteries of survival. Without them, soldiers starved, traders stagnated, messages fell silent. With them, empires stretched across mountains and deserts, as if geography itself had surrendered. Tonight, we wander deeper into this world, not just the stone and wood, but the human hands and human costs hidden beneath the surface of every grand span. The Roman arches, power written in stone, the Romans were, perhaps, the loudest bridge, builders of history. To them, rivers were not obstacles, but challenges waiting to be conquered. They looked at wild torrents and did not pray for a ford. They ordered arches into existence. Imagine the Pons Aemilius in Rome, its arches rising above the Tiber. The stones are set without mortar, locked so tightly that centuries of floods could not easily loosen them. Each block was hauled by slaves or laborers, many of them exhausted, many of them invisible to history. A senator might cut a ribbon at the bridge's completion, but it was calloused hands that shaped the empire's crossings. Arches worked because of a paradox: the very weight of stone could hold itself up. A keystone wedged at the top, pressure distributed across a curve, gravity transformed into stability. Standing on one of these bridges, you would feel both awe and reassurance, as though Rome itself promised permanence. But permanence was a trick. Even the strongest spans collapsed eventually. Floods washed away piers, armies dynamited crossings in desperation. Centuries of neglect let vines creep between the stones. Yet, while they lasted, Roman bridges were propaganda. Each arch announced, the empire is here, and it will remain. The human toll of building every bridge carries hidden stories beneath its surface, and not all are noble. You might imagine the sweat of conscripted men under the Roman legions, or peasants ordered by Chinese emperors to weave bamboo into suspension spans across remote gorges. Some bridges demanded not only labor, but lives. Legends across Asia and Europe whisper of workers entombed within foundations as sacrifices to restless rivers, human bodies believed to steady the stone against collapse. Whether myth or truth, the stories reveal something deeper: that building was terrifying, dangerous, and often fatal. To be assigned to such work was no honor. You might be crushed under a falling pier, swept away in a sudden flood, or poisoned by damp stone dust lodged in your lungs. The completion of a bridge often meant the loss of nameless builders. Empires marched proudly across the result without pausing to remember. The medieval crossings moved forward 1,000 years. Europe's rivers still carved deep divides, and bridges became hubs of both commerce and community. The Ponte Vecchio in Florence, built in the 14th century, wasn't only a crossing. It was a living street. Shops sprouted along its edges, butchers first, later jewelers, their goods spilling toward the water. The bridge throbbed with life, clamor, and barter. Crossing it meant not just reaching the other side of the Arno, but stepping into a market of gossip, scents, and glinting wares. Medieval bridges were rarely neutral. Many were fortified with towers, gates, and toll stations. To cross meant to pay. In that sense, bridges became taxation point, stone embodiments of authority. A feudal lord could control not only the riverbank, but also every cart and traveler who dared cross. The architecture reflected this dual role. Arched spans supported by cut stone suggested stability, but looming gatehouses reminded you of surveillance and power. The very act of crossing was political. Bridges of Asia, suspension and innovation far from Europe, in the deep valleys of Tibet and China. Suspension bridges had taken form centuries earlier. Instead of stone arches, they leaned on ropes, sometimes twisted hemp, sometimes chains, sometimes woven bamboo. Imagine stepping onto one, the slats beneath your feet bounce, the ropes creak, swaying gently with each movement. Below, the river roars. Each step is a negotiation between trust and fear. Yet for villagers, traders, and monks, such crossings were lifelines. They connected isolated valleys, let pilgrims reach monasteries clinging to cliffs, let armies sweep into hidden gorges. The Ming dynasty perfected chain suspension bridges, anchoring massive iron links into stone towers. The Anlin Bridge across the Min River became known as the Bridge of 10,000 Years. It swayed in storms, but it endured. To stand upon it was to feel the ingenuity of craftsmen who understood both metal and motion. Unlike the rigidity of Roman arches, these bridges embraced flexibility. They did not resist nature's sway. They moved with it. It is a lesson in engineering humility. Strength sometimes means yielding. The Ottoman and Persian crossings travel westward again, and the Ottoman Empire's landscape unfolds. Caravanserais dotted the roads, and bridges extended the reach of sultans. Across Anatolia, bridges such as the Malabadi or Sokollu Mehmet Pasa Bridge carried merchants over torrents. Persian architects, too, saw bridges not only as crossings, but as spaces for gathering. The Kaju Bridge in Isfahan became both dam and promenade, a place where water was controlled and people strolled. At dusk, lanterns glimmered, voices echoed, and poetry was recited along its arches. Here the bridge was less a tool of conquest and more a frame for culture. Bridges, as targets, no empire ever ignored the military value of a bridge. To hold one meant to control movement. To destroy one could paralyze an enemy. The retreating Russians burned bridges before Napoleon's advance in 1008. The Chinese dynamited crossings to slow Japanese armies in the 1930. Even in modern wars, the bombing of bridges has meant not just broken stone, but broken supply lines, broken morale. Each time a bridge fell, it left more than physical gaps, it severed lives. Communities once linked were suddenly divided, markets collapsed, families split. In that sense, destroying a bridge is always more than strategy. It is a tearing apart of human fabric. Bridges of memory think of London Bridge, not as the nursery rhyme, but as a structure that has existed in countless forms. Wooden, stone, and eventually modern steel. Each version replaced the last, yet the name endured, carrying centuries of continuity. Bridges often outlast their builders, but they rarely outlast time. And when they fall through flood, war, or planned demolition, they linger in memory. Locals speak of the old bridge, even after decades have passed. Ghosts of crossings remain etched in place. Names, folk songs, and stories. To remember a bridge is to remember connection, the moment when one side of a river was no longer separate from the other. the symbolism of crossing at their core. Bridges have always carried more than carts or armies. They carry meaning. To step onto one is to cross from the known into the unknown, from safety into risk, from present into possibility. In rituals across cultures, bridges symbolize transitions: life to death, ignorance to wisdom, childhood to adulthood. Mythology brims with bridges: the rainbow Bifrost in Norse legend, the Chinvat Bridge in Zoroastrianism, the narrow path souls must walk after death. Even when made of stone or rope, bridges carry spiritual weight. Empires may have used them for conquest, but individuals often saw them as metaphors. To cross is to change. Standing still on the bridge, now imagine yourself pausing midway across one. The river churns below, history flows behind you, possibility stretches ahead. The bridge itself hums with centuries of footsteps: soldiers, merchants, peasants, pilgrims. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear them: the tramp of hobnailed sandals, the creak of ox carts, the rustle of silk robes, the mutter of prayers. All of them crossing because the bridge existed, because someone built it, because an empire ordered it, because human hands labored and sometimes bled to place each stone or lash each rope. Every bridge is a palimpsest of lives. Every empire that spanned rivers did so not with pure might, but with structures like these, silent, practical, yet profoundly symbolic. A pause before tomorrow. As twilight deepens, you remain on the bridge, lingering where past and present meet. Beneath you, the river reminds you that nothing is truly permanent. Water erodes, floods rise, stones shift. Yet above the water, the bridge stands, however precariously, carrying more than bodies. It carries memory. Empires relied on these crossings, but it is ordinary lives that gave them meaning. Farmers bringing wheat, mothers guiding children, monks chanting softly as they shuffled from monastery to village. And tomorrow, as we continue this journey, you will see how bridges were not only built for power, but for faith, for survival, and sometimes for beauty alone. But that is a story for tomorrow night. You pause again in your wandering across the centuries, and you realize something subtle about bridges that you had not noticed before. They are not merely connectors of land. They are also connectors of memory. When a civilization falls, its temples may be looted, its palaces burned, its statues toppled. But bridges, curiously, often linger, perhaps because they are useful, perhaps because to destroy them is to harm yourself, or perhaps because they are simply too stubborn, too well, seated in stone and earth to yield easily to fire or neglect. And so, as empires shift, bridges endure, carrying not only travelers and armies, but also a ghostly archive of every foot that has crossed them. Think of the Ponte Sant'Angelo in Rome. Built under Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century, its elegant arches still carry pedestrians today. The fortress it leads to has changed names, owners, and purposes, from imperial mausoleum to papal stronghold to museum. Yet the bridge itself is the same span that legionaries once marched across in sandals, and that Renaissance pilgrims later walked with rosaries in hand. You can feel the strange weight of continuity there, a bridge unbothered by centuries of transformation, quietly serving whoever needs it. This is the beginning of a pattern you will follow in this section. Bridges not just as structures of stone and wood, but as carriers of empires themselves, quietly sustaining trade, conquest, religion, and identity. The Ottoman arches over the Balkans step eastward into the Balkans, and you find the bridges of the Ottoman Empire. Unlike Rome's grand aqueduct-like spans, Ottoman bridges often exude restraint. A single high arch or a graceful sweep over a mountain stream. Yet they were no less powerful in their symbolism. The empire stretched across rivers that divided cultures, languages, and religions. By laying bridges, the sultans declared, not only to their subjects but also to their rivals, that the empire was unbroken. One such bridge stands at Mostar in Bosnia. The Stari Most, or Old Bridge, was completed in 1566 under the orders of Suleiman the Magnificent. Its impossibly slender stone arch leapt across the Neretva River, connecting a town that had always been split between banks. For 4 centuries, the bridge was the town's heart, Markets, festivals, and gatherings all centered there. And when it was destroyed in 1993 during war, the wound was not merely physical. It was psychological, cultural, spiritual. Rebuilding the bridge years later was not just an act of construction but of healing. And here lies another truth. Bridges carry empires, but when empires collapse, the bridges carry grief. They are monuments to the possibility of unity and the tragedy of division. Bridges as sacred pathways. Consider now the bridges that carried not armies but pilgrims. In Japan, the Uji Bridge near Kyoto, first constructed in the 7th century, was more than a river crossing. It linked travelers to temples and tea fields, threading together the spiritual life of a region. Pilgrims crossing it believed the journey itself was part of the prayer, that every step across the wooden span was a meditation, a soft echo of devotion. In India, bridges across the Ganges functioned similarly. Wooden and rope crossings in Varanasi were lined with ascetics, sellers of flowers, and boatmen offering blessings. To cross was to move not only between two banks of a river, but also between realms of worldly life and spiritual purification. When Mughal emperors sponsored stronger spans across sacred rivers, they did not only enable trade, they entwined their authority with the rhythms of devotion itself. You begin to see how bridges served more than the economy. They served identity. They told people who they were, where they belonged, what they believed. Wooden walkways and forgotten empires, but not every empire could afford stone. Some worked in wood, creating bridges that endured only through memory and record. The Inca in the Andes are a perfect example. Their rope suspension bridges, woven from iku grass, spanned terrifying gorges. Every year communities would gather to replace them, plaiting new fibers, singing as they worked. The bridge was not only infrastructure, it was ritual. When Spanish conquerors arrived, they crossed those same bridges with armor clanking, astonished that mere grass could hold them. But what the Spaniards failed to see was that these bridges were symbols of something more enduring than stone: cooperation, communal labor, and renewal. For the Inca, the bridge was not permanent because no structure could be. Instead, the act of rebuilding was permanence itself. And here you pause, because suddenly you realize something humbling. An empire can be carried by stone, by mortar, by arches that last millennia. Or it can be carried by memory, by ritual, by annual renewal. Both are bridges. Both carry civilizations across time. Bridges in the Age of Discovery leap now into the 16th and 17th centuries, when European powers began stretching beyond their homelands. Colonial empires relied on ships, yes, but once ashore, they also needed bridges. In the Philippines, Spanish administrators ordered the construction of stone bridges to link Manila with outlying provinces. Many still stand, their moss-covered arches quietly recalling the forced labor of Filipino workers who built them. In Mexico, Spanish rule reshaped old Aztec causeways into sturdier crossings, embedding imperial authority into the literal ground. Even in the Americas, bridges were often the first markers of permanent colonial presence. Timber spans across rivers in Virginia, wooden crossings in Brazil, all testified that Europeans did not come merely to visit. They came to stay, and bridges, as always, were the surest signs of permanence. The language of power. Pause again. Ask yourself, why did emperors, sultans, kings, and colonizers all invest in bridges? Was it because they were useful? Yes, but also because bridges spoke a language of power that everyone could understand. A road might be ignored, a market might be burned, a fortress might be avoided, but a bridge cannot be unseen. It dominates the landscape, a line of authority written across water or ravine. To walk upon it was to acknowledge, even unconsciously, the empire that had placed it there. Look back at Rome, at China's Grand Canal, at the Ottomans, at the Inca. Each understood that a bridge was not merely an engineering feat. It was a signature, a declaration: we are here, we will endure. When bridges fail, and yet, for all their endurance, bridges can also betray. Think of the bridge of Arta in Greece. whose folklore tells of collapse after collapse until a human life was buried within its foundations. Such stories reflect an old truth. Bridges demand sacrifice, whether of labor, lives, or wealth. In medieval Europe, peasants often resented bridge tolls, seeing them as symbols of exploitation. In China, when the Yellow River flooded and swept away bridges, entire trade systems collapsed with it. In the 20th century, when bridges were bombed in war, from France to Korea to Vietnam, their absence revealed just how much empires depended on them. To cut a bridge was to cut the artery of empire. And so you learn this paradox. A bridge is both the strongest and the most fragile thing an empire can possess. The modern continuity step at last into modern times. Bridges still carry empires, though today those empires may not be monarchies but nations, corporations, and global economies. The Brooklyn Bridge in New York became not only a practical span, but also a symbol of American ingenuity, confidence, and industrial power. The Howrah Bridge in Kolkata, completed under British rule, still pulses with life, carrying tens of thousands each day, long after the empire that built it vanished. And in the 21st century, bridges like the Hong Kong, Macau Bridge, or Turkey's 1915 Canakkale Bridge remind us that states still declare their presence through stone, steel, and concrete. The empire has changed shape, but the bridges remain its language. Closing reflection, you look back over the bridges you have visited. Stone, wood, rope, iron, steel. You realize now that each was more than a way across. Each was a declaration of belonging, of unity, of domination, of hope. Each carried not just empires but entire ways of seeing the world. And as you stand here, imagining the countless feet that once echoed on each span, you understand something quiet but profound. Every bridge is two bridges. One is physical, carrying people and goods. The other is invisible, carrying memory and meaning. One day the stones may crumble, the ropes may fray, the steel may rust, but the other bridge, the bridge of story, remains. And in that sense, the bridges truly do carry empires forever. You walk through the old city at dawn, when the air is cool enough to soften stone and silence still lingers in the cracks between buildings. The streets you tread are not truly streets at all. Once, long ago, before the stones were laid and the markets sprawled, these channels were water. Clear water, dark water, rushing water, beneath your feet, buried, walled off, forgotten. An entire liquid skeleton still runs through the veins of the city. You don't notice it most days, few ever do. But the ground remembers, and so does history. The world has always built itself along rivers, but when rivers did not run exactly where people wanted, they forced them underground. What you call a sewer today was once a proud waterway. What you dismiss as a drainage ditch was once a lifeline. Cities, in their hunger to expand, paved over streams, tunneled canals beneath foundations, hid whole lakes beneath walls. And so, centuries later, you walk a street, but unknowingly walk a riverbed. You stand before a palace, but unknowingly stand before a dam. Pause a moment. Imagine peeling back the stone of the street beneath you, removing it like the lid of a box. Below would not be dirt, no. Below would be brick tunnels, curved vaults, arched supports, darkened water flowing in silence, catching torchlight like melted metal. The air would smell of iron and dampness, like a cave. A century ago, people rode through these spaces in small boats. 2 centuries ago, families fetched water here. 3 centuries ago, ceremonies were held on the banks. 4 centuries ago, this was simply a river under the open sky, and the city was barely born. Civilizations have long treated water like a negotiable truth. In Rome, engineers tunneled aqueducts beneath hills, laying arcades of stone that carried fresh water across impossible distances. In medieval London, the River Fleet, once wide enough to float barges, was eventually covered, bricked, and converted into one of the city's underground sewers. In Paris, the Beaver was swallowed by urban growth, its green banks transformed into gutters, its flow hidden in tunnels. In Mexico City, Entire lakes were drained so that streets could be laid atop mud. The Aztecs had canals like threads of silver across the valley. The Spanish turned them into causeways. The ground still shifts because of it. And what is a city, really, without water? A mistake. A gathering of stone doomed to thirst. That is why every settlement grew by a stream or sea. But once people became too many, and their waste too great, water became not a friend but a threat. So they buried it. They reshaped it. They forced it underground, away from sight, away from blame. Yet for centuries, people still walked these buried rivers. The underworld of waterways was no myth. It was as real as any cathedral. You would find boatmen rowing by torchlight, ferrymen who knew every bend, smugglers hiding wares, children daring each other to descend ladders into echoing brick vaults. You would hear the constant dripping of condensation, the muffled roar of water hammering stone in storms. These underground waterways were not only veins of the city, but its lungs, breathing out damp air, carrying off its filth, cooling its heart. Even now, when you lean against an old stone wall, you sometimes feel it tremble faintly. It is not traffic that shakes it, not footsteps. It is the forgotten water beneath, still moving, still waiting. A city that floated above rivers imagine Venice, though Venice wears its canals openly. Its bridges are famous, its gondolas a spectacle. But what of the cities that are secret Venices, where you never see the gondolas, yet they existed, where water still flows but is silenced by stone above it? In ancient Constantinople, cisterns were built vast enough to house armies. Their marble columns rose from black water like drowned temples. One of them, the Basilica cistern, still survives, with its Medusa heads and endless rows of pillars. People above had no idea that, just beneath their markets and streets, an underground forest of stone stood in darkness, feeding the city. In Edo modern Tokyo, channels were cut like latticework, delivering fresh water and carrying waste. In times of fire, watermen knew every underground reservoir, every hidden culvert. They could vanish into them, escape through them. The surface city was wood and fire. The underground city was water and survival. You begin to see the pattern. Cities that endured were not simply those with walls or armies. They were those with hidden waters, when the waters turned against them, but burying a river is not an act without cost. Stone cracks, vaults collapse, water remembers its bed. Time and again, cities that thought they had tamed their waterways were humbled. London's fleet, turned sewer, became a source of plague. Its waters stagnated, carrying disease. Paris's beaver, once picturesque, turned black with tannery waste, fouling the air until authorities buried it entirely. In Mexico City, the drained lakes left the city sinking, streets warping, buildings tilting like ships caught in mud. Even today, during storms, hidden rivers rise. They roar back through manholes, they drown basements, they reclaim their right. You might think of the city as master, but in those moments you realize it is guest. Listening to the forgotten waters, you pause on your walk. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the muted echo of something below. Not voices, not footsteps, but flow. It is steady, patient, old. You do not need to see it to know it is there. That is the strange truth of cities. They never truly erase what they build over. Beneath every pavement lies another layer, and beneath that, another. A canal under a road, a river under a canal, a marsh under a river, a sea under a marsh, time stacked like bricks. You walk through it all without noticing. Yet once you begin to imagine it, you can never stop. Every drainpipe, every grating, every low lying alley suddenly feels like a clue. Beneath is more, beneath is older, beneath is water. And so the story begins here at the edge of a realization that the ground beneath your feet is less solid than you think, that every city hides rivers, that every empire floated on water, sometimes openly, sometimes in silence. The bridges above may have carried armies, but the waters below carried entire civilizations. And that is where your story of forgotten waterways begins. You wake before dawn, the world still hushed and gray, the air thick with the promise of heat. The road stretches ahead of you like a ribbon unrolling into infinity. It is not just dirt. It is the spine of empires, the fragile yet enduring line that keeps kingdoms bound together. You walk slowly, feeling each stone beneath your sandals, the cool of the night still lingering in the surface before the sun turns it scorching. This road is not natural. It is a scar carved into the earth, born of chisels, hammers, calloused hands, and weary backs. To understand it, you must imagine the armies of laborers who once bent over these very stones, lifting and fitting, sweating and groaning, until a straight path cleaved through wilderness, marsh, and mountain. Roads were never merely travel routes. They were symbols of power, proofs that human order could tame the chaos of geography. The birth of stone paths in the earliest days, roads were nothing more than animal tracks widened by feet and hooves. But when rulers realized that trade and conquest required more than mud paths, everything changed. The Romans were perhaps the loudest architects of this revolution. To them, a road was not just convenience. It was the veins of the empire feeding its lifeblood. Imagine a Roman engineer unrolling his wax tablet, pointing out where marshland must be drained, where hills must be cut, where layers of crushed stone and gravel must be stacked. He knew this was not only for today, but for centuries. Roman roads were built in layers, sand and gravel at the bottom, larger stones laid atop them, and then carefully cut paving slabs fitted so tightly that even weeds struggled to grow. They were crowned in the center, slightly arched, so rainwater would run to the side. Every detail was thought through, and every detail cost sweat. The laborers who built these roads were often soldiers themselves, stationed in provinces far from Rome, their spades and picks becoming as important as their swords. Others were prisoners of war or slaves, driven into the earth with little choice but to obey. Each stone you step upon might once have been hoisted by a man cursing his fate, his body bent beneath imperial ambition. The rhythm of marches now picture the sound of an army advancing, not just hundreds of men, but tens of thousands. Their iron-tipped sandals strike the road in perfect rhythm. Clack, clack, clack. The road is not merely a surface. It is a drum, carrying the echo of empire outward. Without these paved arteries, no general could move men so quickly. The legions of Rome could march 20 miles in a day because the roads beneath them held firm. The soldiers trusted the ground the way a sailor trusts the sea current. And with every mile, the empire stretched further, not just militarily but culturally. Merchants, pilgrims, tax collectors, scholars, all followed the soldiers, carrying goods and ideas. The roads, you realize, were not neutral. They were weapons just as sharp as any spear. Where a road ran, conquest followed, and where conquest passed, the road remained, binding the conquered land forever into the empire's body. Roads beyond Rome was not alone in this. The Inca of the Andes created their own astonishing web of highways, nearly 25,000 miles of stone, paved paths, cutting across mountains, valleys, and deserts. They did not use wheels nor horses, yet their system worked flawlessly. Relay runners called chasquis sprinted along the roads, carrying messages knotted into cords of quipu. With every handoff, the empire stayed united. Imagine standing on an Andean ridge, watching a lone runner fly down a road carved along cliffs, the mountain wind tearing at his tunic, his feet pounding the stone. In China, roads stitched together the great dynasties. The Qin, the Han, and those that followed knew that the Great Wall alone could not defend them. They needed arteries to pump troops, taxes, and grain. The imperial roads radiated outward from the capital, measured and maintained with bureaucratic obsession. Along them rolled carts of silk, rice, and porcelain, destined for markets that reached as far as Rome itself. And in Persia, centuries earlier, the royal road of Darius stretched more than 1,500 miles, so well designed that a mounted messenger could cover the distance in mere days. Herodotus marveled at it, saying that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night could halt the couriers who sped along its length. If those words sound familiar, it is because they echo even today in the creed of modern postal services. The dust of travelers but roads were not only for soldiers and rulers. Bend lower, and you see the feet of ordinary travelers. A farmer pushing a cart of figs. A mother leading her child to the market in the next town. A monk with a bundle of scriptures tucked beneath his robe. A peddler with pots clanging at his side. For them, the road was a lifeline. It carried hope, danger, hunger, and profit. It carried strangers into one's village and carried one's sons away. It was both blessing and burden. Dust rose constantly, clinging to clothes and faces, coating skin until every traveler wore the same pale mask. At wayside inns, people washed the road from their feet before eating, their toes raw from the miles. At shrines along the roadside, they prayed for safety before setting off again. Every road was holy in its own way, sanctified by human need. Bandits, tolls, and watchtowers, of course. Not all who walked the roads did so honestly. Where goods moved, so did greed. Bandits lurked in forests and ravines, watching for weak caravans. Merchants sometimes traveled in armed groups, or they paid tolls to local lords for protection. The empires knew this danger, and so they dotted their roads with watchtowers, milestones, and patrol stations. In Rome, milestones marked every 1,000 paces, carved with the emperor's name. They were not just guides, but reminders. This road belongs to Caesar. In medieval Europe, roads often belonged to whoever could defend them. Kings declared them royal highways, but local lords collected tolls. Bridges and fords were especially profitable points, where no traveler could pass without paying. Every coin dropped into the tollkeeper's hand was proof that power flowed through the road as much as through the sword. The fragile immortality of stone, and yet, even the mightiest roads crumble, stones crack. Weeds pry through seams, dust gathers until the road becomes indistinguishable from the earth around it. Civilizations forget the work of their ancestors, and the roads vanish into silence. Still, traces remain. Walk through a forest in Europe, and you may stumble upon a straight line of raised earth, moss, covered, leading nowhere. That is a Roman road, asleep beneath centuries of soil. Hike through the Andes, and you may find a stretch of Inca highway still intact. Stones fitted so tightly they defy earthquakes. In deserts, old caravan trails remain visible from the sky, faint scars across endless dunes. These remnants whisper a truth. Roads are memory. They outlast the builders, the kings, the merchants, even the empires themselves. They endure because they are more than infrastructure. They are witness. Walking onward as the sun rises higher, you feel the stones grow warm beneath your feet. The road ahead is endless, but it no longer feels heavy. Every step you take carries centuries with it. You are not just a traveler. You are part of the same flow that moved legions, pilgrims, and traders before you. You think of the hands that laid each stone, the rulers who demanded them, the soldiers who marched over them, the merchants who wore them thin, and the weeds that one day will reclaim them. You realize that a road is never finished. It is always in motion, always between what has been and what will be. The dust rises around your ankles. Somewhere in that dust are the ashes of empires, the breath of animals long dead, the sweat of builders, and the prayers of wanderers. You inhale it, and you belong to it. The road ties you to everything that came before and everything that will follow. And so you keep walking calm, unhurried, knowing that this road, like all roads, will not end here. It will carry on, deeper into the world, deeper into history. The river still breathes around you, whispering its 1,000-year memory, and you walk along its banks as though you are following the thoughts of a forgotten world. The air is calm, heavy with dampness, and the earth under your feet feels neither modern nor ancient, but suspended somewhere in between. You notice, not far off, the remnants of timbers buried in the mud, their surfaces blackened by time. They are not random logs. They once belonged to something deliberate, an engineering attempt by hands that have long returned to dust. You crouch closer, and you realize you are standing beside the traces of one of the earliest waterworks the Empire ever dared to attempt. It is humbling, almost unnerving, to consider how much of human civilization depended on these fragile acts of construction. Every empire, no matter how radiant its banners or how brutal its armies, lived or died by its ability to move water. The ancients knew this instinctively, long before they could name it in words. Water was both the foundation and the limit. Rivers gave crops, fed animals, cooled bodies in unbearable summers, and carried boats heavy with grain and salt. But rivers also betrayed. They flooded fields, swallowed villages, and cut paths of destruction without hesitation. The rulers of the old dynasties understood that conquest by the sword was meaningless if their people could not drink, eat, or trade, and so they turned to water, shaping it, taming it, carving it into canals and aqueducts. What you see now, these rotten timbers lodged in mud, were once the scaffolding for a system of channels meant to redirect a river's course. Thousands of peasants would have worked here, carrying baskets of soil on bent shoulders, hammering stakes into wet ground, chanting or groaning with each step. They were not remembered by name, but they shaped history more than the kings who ordered them to work. You imagine the process unfolding slowly, like a ritual of collective endurance. At dawn, men and women would rise before the sun, their legs heavy from the labor of yesterday, their feet blistered. They would tie ropes around their waists and drag stones to the bank. Children too young to carry rocks would haul water jars to keep the workers from collapsing in the summer heat. Overseers barked orders, but there was no need for cruelty. Hunger itself was whip enough. If you did not dig, if you did not build, there might be no harvest next year. And without harvest, there was famine. The irony was bitter. These peasants were carving channels not for themselves, but for the empire's granaries and its markets in distant capitals. Yet indirectly, their survival was bound to the success of the work. The canals would one day carry barges of rice, wheat, and millet, feeding millions far beyond this valley. And when the canals worked, the emperor claimed glory. Priests gave thanks to river gods, and officials boasted of prosperity. But the true story lay here, in the mud under your fingertips, the story of people whose spines bent under baskets until they could bend no more. The deeper you follow the thought, the more you see how waterworks were more than engineering. They were politics, power made visible. A new canal was not only a channel of water, but a line of control, binding villages to cities, farmers to rulers. The empire spread its grip not just through armies and taxes, but through these hidden arteries of water. To resist a canal was to resist the empire itself, and often such resistance was crushed with equal force as rebellion on the battlefield. Yet even so, some whispered that these canals were fragile lifelines, not eternal monuments. A single season of drought, a sudden flood, or neglect by corrupt officials could turn the proudest waterworks into ruins. Entire towns once flourished beside a flowing canal, only to vanish when its banks collapsed or silt filled its course. To study these works is to see not only triumph, but fragility, the delicate balance between human ambition and nature's indifference. You pause in your imagining and listen again to the river. Its voice is slow and steady, as though mocking the arrogance of those who thought they could truly master it. Empires rise and fall, but the river flows on, reshaping the land in ways that no decree can halt. The timbers beneath you are proof of this. Once, they were strong enough to hold back a current. Now they are no stronger than driftwood. Still, the legacy of those forgotten workers survives, if not in their names, then in the very survival of the people who came after them. Without their canals and dikes, cities would have starved, markets would have emptied, roads would have fallen silent, and perhaps the empire itself would have crumbled decades, even centuries earlier. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that realization settle in. History is rarely made by the victories sung in epic poems. More often, it is made by the quiet persistence of labor, digging ditches, hauling water, stacking stones in the mud. The empire's bridges may have carried armies, its palaces may have housed emperors, but none of it mattered if the water did not flow. When you open your eyes, the riverbank seems transformed. It is no longer just earth and wood, but a palimpsest of lives lived and lost. You imagine the soundscape, the splash of oars in shallow water, the rhythm of shovels hitting mud, the creak of wooden pulleys hauling stones. Somewhere in the distance, a gong would sound, calling workers to pause for a meager meal of millet gruel. Then, after a few breaths, they would return to the endless cycle of labor. The sun would rise, burn, and fade. The moon would rise, pale and silent. And still, the digging would continue. You sense how this story repeats itself across continents, not just in this river valley, but in Rome's aqueducts, in Mesopotamia's irrigation ditches, in the intricate canals of the Indus. The technology differed. The gods worshipped were not the same, but the principle was universal. Where water was tamed, civilizations bloomed. Where it was lost, civilizations withered. And so, as you linger on this riverbank, you feel as though you are standing on the very pulse of empire, not in the marble halls of rulers, but here in the mud, where anonymous hands once shaped the fate of millions. The bridges of power were not only built of stone archways across rivers, but of waterworks themselves, carrying not just people, but the very sustenance of life. Night begins to settle around you, wrapping the land in its cool breath. The water reflects the fading light, turning the river's surface into a mirror of fire and shadow. The timbers almost vanish in the gloom, but you know they are still there, buried witnesses to a history that rarely finds its way into books. You rise, brushing mud from your hands, and walk along the bank. The river continues its slow song, as though promising that tomorrow, and tomorrow again, it will still be here, long after the memory of kings has vanished. And somewhere, in that continuity, lies the truth of empire. It is not banners that endure, but rivers, canals, and bridges, the quiet infrastructure of survival. Everything else, even glory, is only temporary. You wake at dawn to the sound of iron striking stone, the same rhythm you have heard for months now, the measured beat of chisels, the groan of wood as scaffolding tightens, the echo of hammers rippling across the valley. Sleep comes lightly when you live beside a construction site of such scale, and yet, somehow, your body has learned to treat it as lullaby. The clang of tools, the bark of orders, the shuffle of men in sandals. It is the world's heartbeat, and you are caught inside it. The bridge that you and thousands of others labor upon now no longer looks like a wild idea, no longer a madman's sketch scribbled upon parchment. The spans have grown, stone by stone, log by log. The skeleton has taken muscle. From the riverbanks, pillars thrust upward like stubborn teeth, capped now with carefully cut arches. Wooden scaffolds cling to them like vines, trembling whenever a worker climbs too quickly. Rope pulleys swing overhead, creaking with the strain of stone blocks. Every corner of the site seems alive, buzzing with motion. Your task is humble compared to the grand design. You carry buckets of mortar, mix lime until your arms ache, and wedge wedges beneath loose stones. You do not decide angles, nor measure the curving perfection of the arches. Those decisions belong to men with clean hands and wax tablets, men whose soft voices can halt hundreds with a gesture. But you, and those like you, are the hands and backs that give their ideas weight. And the bridge, this great, sweeping arc across the river, would never exist without the calluses of peasants. It is easy to forget that only a season ago, this valley was open ground. Fishermen squatted by the river with reed nets, oxen drank at the banks, and children skipped stones across the water. Then came the surveyors, the engineers, the overseers with their pointed shoes. Stakes hammered into earth, chalk lines marking where the river would soon bow to stone. And in their wake, a flood of laborers, farmers from neighboring villages, prisoners granted temporary release, conscripts who never chose the work but found themselves tied to it by law or debt. Now those same fishermen carry mortar, their shoulders powdered white. Children no longer skip stones but scavenge broken fragments from the worksite to use as playthings. The river has been forced to obey, diverted, narrowed, managed by temporary dams. It flows sullenly through wooden channels, as if sulking at being told where to go. You wonder, sometimes, whether rivers resent human ambition. By midday, the sun leans heavy on your back. Sweat darkens your tunic until it clings like damp bark. Lime dust cakes to your skin, stinging whenever it finds a cut. Around you, men cough through clouds of powdered stone. Yet still they work, climbing scaffolds barefoot, balancing with loads strapped to their backs. You glance upward at them and think of ants upon branches, fragile, tireless, almost invisible against the grand thing they are making. The engineers remind you constantly of what is at stake. This bridge, they say, is not just a road across water. It is a tether, a lifeline binding one half of the empire to another. With it, armies can march faster, merchants can carry goods deeper inland, tax collectors can arrive with greater efficiency. The bridge is not stone, they say. It is power carved into the earth, and every bucket of mortar you carry helps secure that power. Their words slide across you like rain on slate. You do not dream of armies. You do not care about merchants. What matters is the rhythm of your body, the bending, lifting, carrying, setting down. What matters is whether the foreman notices if you rest too long. What matters is whether your feet find grip upon the planks, slick with water and dust. The empire's grand ambitions feel distant, abstract, but the stone that scrapes your palms is real. The bucket biting your shoulders is real. Still, you cannot deny a strange pride as the arches lengthen. Each day you return to find them taller, their curves smoother, their shadows stretching farther across the water. The bridge has begun to resemble a horizon drawn in stone. Children whisper that one day it will touch the clouds. You know that is foolish, but secretly you do not mind their belief. At times, when the workday ends and the scaffolds fall silent, you stand alone and gaze at what you have built. The river glimmers black in the moonlight, and above it the half-finished span hangs like a ribcage across the sky. You think of all the feet that will one day cross it. Soldiers, horses, pilgrims, traders. Feet that will never know your name, never imagine the sweat that cemented each stone. Yet they will walk more easily because of you. Is that enough to call this labor meaningful? The foremen care nothing for your thoughts. Their concerns are immediate. Cracks that must be patched, ropes that must be replaced, stones that must be shifted into tighter embrace. Orders ring across the site like whip cracks. A worker falls from scaffolding one morning, slips on dust, tumbles with a cry, vanishes into the shallows below. His body is dragged out, limp as wet cloth. Work halts only long enough to carry him away. By afternoon the hammers resume. The bridge must continue. You feel the truth then, sharp as flint. The empire values the bridge more than the men who build it. Stone is eternal, they tell you. Flesh is replaceable. And yet, men still come. Some for wages, others because refusal means punishment. Some because they believe the empire's dream of binding land and water with stone. Others simply because there is no choice. The bridge becomes a machine that eats bodies and spits out progress. Still, there are moments of gentleness hidden among the toil. On certain evenings, when the foremen's backs are turned, men sing. Low songs, ancient ones carried from villages, lullabies reshaped into work chants. The river answers softly, carrying their voices downstream. For a little while, the scaffolds feel less like cages and more like stages for human resilience. You remember one such evening especially well. The moon was swollen, the water restless. Men sat upon stones, sharing bread hard as bone. One old worker told a story of a bridge his grandfather had helped build long ago. That bridge, too, was meant to last forever, meant to prove the empire's strength. But decades later, floods tore it down in a single night. The empire boasted of eternity, Yet the river laughed and took back what was its own. The men chuckled darkly, and someone whispered, "Perhaps we build not for eternity, but only until the river decides otherwise." The words linger in your skull long after. When you climb scaffolds, when you balance buckets, when you press mortar into cracks, you cannot help but imagine the river beneath, patient, waiting. The bridge is mighty, yes, but water is patient, and patience can be stronger than stone. One evening, you glimpse something that shakes you more deeply. An engineer, usually proud and sharp, stands staring at the rising arches. His wax tablet hangs forgotten at his side. You hear him murmur to another, "What if we have built too heavy? What if the river scours the foundations faster than we imagined?" His voice is hushed, almost fearful. For the first time, you realize that even those with clean hands doubt. Even those who command are haunted by uncertainty. The empire pretends at certainty, but deep beneath, it is as fragile as any rope upon a scaffold. The thought does not free you, but it makes you less alone. As the weeks drag into months, the bridge stretches farther, its shadow cutting the valley like a blade. Traders already begin to gather nearby, sensing the promise of easier travel. Inns spring up along the road. Farmers complain of land lost to construction, yet merchants cheer. Already, life reshapes itself around the structure not yet finished. You wonder if bridges, even half built, bend not just rivers, but also the people who orbit them. And through it all, your body hardens. Calluses thicken until your palms feel like leather. Your back knots with muscle. Your shoulders ache even in sleep. When you first began, a single bucket left you gasping. Now you carry two, stride across planks, climb ladders without thought. The bridge has reshaped you just as it reshapes the river. You are both worker and worked upon. By the time the year turns, only one great span remains unjoined. Workers gather on the banks, staring at the gap left like a missing tooth. Across it, men on the opposite side stare back, each side waiting for the day when stone meets stone, when the halves kiss and the bridge becomes whole. The gap is small compared to what has already been built, yet it feels immense, as if the river resists until the final moment. The engineers call this the most dangerous stage. The arches lean toward one another, their weight straining against the scaffolds. A miscalculation now could collapse months of labor, and so the sight grows tense, every hammer strike sharper, every rope double, checked. Men whisper of omens, of birds flying across the gap, of strange currents in the river. Fear hangs thicker than dust. You lie awake some nights, listening to the water and wondering, when the final stone is set, will the river rage? Will it try to shake the bridge free, thrash against its new leash? Or will it surrender quietly, flowing beneath like a prisoner in chains? You do not know. But you sense that moment is near, and when it comes, it will change not only the valley, but you. For once the bridge is whole, once the empire has claimed victory over the river, you will face a question harder than any stone. What will remain of you when the work is finished? And so you rise each morning, carry your bucket, climb your scaffold, and press mortar into the bones of an empire, knowing that soon, very soon, the bridge will open its mouth across the river and swallow the world whole.